Well, welcome to the Encounter Faith podcast. My name is Ross, and I am so grateful that you're here today because today I get to sit down with my dear friend, Elisabeth Lectka. Elisabeth, welcome. Thanks for doing this.
Good morning.
So yesterday was Mother's Day, and you were able to preach in our worship center and gave it one of those sermons that when you hear it, you're free. I don't know if you listener have had this experience in church where you're like, yep, that was for me. Yep, that was for me. Yep, that's the thing I want people to say more in church. It was one of those moments. So first of all, just on a personal note, thank you for being able to share a good word yesterday.
And you were in the second row, so I could see you the whole time.
Yeah. Spoiler alert, people. Sit up front. If you're the kind of person who listens to a podcast about a sermon, sit up front. Okay. But a lot of what your message talked about, the reason I think I personally resonated with it so much is it centered a conversation around literally in the case of how you framed it yesterday, entrusted faith, which I want to ask you to define in a second, that I think too often is one of those things in church that we understand to be important, but never actually dive into. So for sake of just setting a little bit of a groundwork, when we talk about entrusted faith and how you shared about it yesterday, what do we mean by that?
Yeah, the word entrusted, Pamela and I kind of workshopped our sermons together and really zeroed in on the word entrusted from 2 Timothy chapter 1 and 2. There's two places that we see that in the English translation. And for me, I think that really resonated with me because of the action and responsibility that comes from that word entrusted, that we inherit a faith that has been given to us on purpose, and that purpose is to then share it with somebody else. Yeah. And so the kind of partner idea of being invested in, being entrusted with, and then investing in others and entrusting the faith to others, kind of passing it down, discipleship sort of concepts.
Mm-hmm. It's one of those things where I feel like you're not going to get a ton of pushback when you say things like, hey, child discipleship is important, or we should invest in the next generation, or some of these big, broad concepts. Mm-hmm. But I think what too many churches do is not sort of walk the general congregation through how. And I think so many parents like myself, so many soon-to-be parents like you, so many folks are walking around going, I know this is important, but I don't know how.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of research, there's a lot of statistics out there that suggest that parents particularly are walking around feeling ill-equipped on how to disciple their kids. And as a result, grandparents are having to play a larger role, which is great. We should have multi-generational discipleship. The church is having to play an outside role in the individual discipleship. And these are all important things, mm-hmm. but our priorities have gotten out of whack. Mm-hmm. So what I'm curious about, just to kind of kick things off, is thinking about who entrusted their faith to you. Now that you have the benefit of hindsight, now that this is the water you swim in every day, mm-hmm. I'm curious sort of what worked and what didn't.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that I think about when it comes to like child discipleship, family discipleship, how do you teach your kids the faith? I think what you just said is spot on of like, okay, parents spend the most time with their kids, so they have the most influence in the life and like faith development of their kids. But it's also not on parents alone. Mm-hmm. So for me, like my parents were big influencers in that. And for a while growing up, it wasn't like the most important thing for us to go to church, but we still went to church.
Sure.
And it was about when I hit middle school, and the confirmation conversation was beginning to surface. My dad was raised Catholic. My mom was raised Lutheran. So like confirmation's a big deal.
Yep.
So we were about hitting middle school and that it became more real. And so my mom signed up as my small group leader for middle school ministry. And I did not want to go, but my mom was there. Yeah. She made me go.
Yeah.
And so for 6th and 7th grade, my mom was my small group leader. Yep. And I remember significant times in middle school. Like there are memories where I was at middle school camp and like, oh, things are kind of starting to make sense. In 8th grade, Bethany Hammer was my small group leader. I don't remember that. She reminded me of that like
Nice.
years later. And she remembers when my grandpa died, sitting in one of the closets here at Good Shepherd and just like talking with me and praying with me. And I think it's like, I don't remember that moment, but how important for me in that moment was it that there was an adult that was willing to sit with me in my hurt and my pain.
Yeah.
And so like, I think about, okay, yeah, mom made me go through confirmation. I went to the confirmation retreat and I did not want to be there. Yeah. I brought my phone. It was against the rules.
Nice.
I was texting my boyfriend in the bathroom.
Sure.
Really rebellious.
Yeah. Rule breaker Elizabeth is one of my favorite
there
Elizabeths.
Yeah. And I checked the box on confirmation. I was not at that time, like I was just not really interested in the faith. And so like, you might look back at that and say like, oh, that didn't work. My parents were forcing me to be there and maybe that didn't work. But, you know, fast forward to my sophomore year of high school, my friend group was changing in high school and I was finding myself kind of on the outside and, kind of losing friends, not really sure where, like who I wanted to hang out with. And my mom encouraged me to go back to youth group. And so there was somebody there that I had known from my confirmation classes. And because I knew her, I was willing to stay. Yeah. And then I was invited to plan the confirmation retreat that I didn't want to be at the year before. and so it was like my mom kept forcing me to go until the right time came around where I was like, oh, wait, this is good for me. Yeah. It took years for that to happen. And so when I think about like the role my parents played, it sometimes worked. Sometimes it worked eventually, but it was a battle to get there, of like putting me in environments outside of of our family where I could like be around other people who were living out the faith.
So there's a couple things I hear in that. One is there's this desire, I think, particularly in younger generation of parents, of letting your kid kind of dictate those kinds of decisions, right? Which is great. There are far too many people in the church who are not in the church, who are walking around because with this level of church hurt, because they felt, for lack of a better term, forced into spiritual rituals, spiritual practices. And as soon as they were able to have a level of agency, they would turn around and walk the other way. So now we have a generation of parents who are trying to do the opposite. Yeah. Right? The reality, though, is that a situation like yours is closer to what can be a universal truth. There are no universal truths, especially in parenting, of your parents were providing a structure. Your parents were providing a clear set of expectations, clear sort of boundaries for you that you broke in the bathroom when you're texting your boyfriend, but that's a separate issue. But the level of that kind of initial environment and those kind of initial boundaries is what fostered you to eventually feel like you belonged in that space. And too many times, I think we try to be overly heavy-handed or not involved at all. And then we wind up going, oh, our kid's not in the church at all. And how did that happen? Yeah. I think
one of the things with my parents is like, I don't remember a ton of like faith practices at home. Sure. So like that wasn't really a part of my upbringing, but they didn't just send me to church. They did it with me. Yeah. Like that, it wasn't just like, oh, we expect you to like know these Christian things. So like go to church and do confirmation. But like my mom was willing to show up with me. Yeah. And the reason she only was my small group leader for 6th and 7th grade was then she was my brother's small group leader after that. And then my brother's small group leader after that. So like she did the same thing with all of us. That's awesome. Willing to like jump in there and be a 6th grade boy's small group leader. Yeah. Because like she wasn't just sending us to church. She was going to do that with us.
Yeah. I think the church would look a lot different if we all just listened to whoever signs up to facilitate 6th grade small group boys.
Amen.
But that's probably a separate podcast. So you are someone who has spent a majority of your ministry career up to this point in student ministry or family ministry in various capacities. one of the things that I'm interested about is you're able to now have this sense of looking back. You're very close to wrapping up your seminary. Congratulations on that, by the way. The idea that anyone wants to go back to school is banana pants to me, but that's a separate issue. You, though, are able to look back. One of the things I'm curious about is when you are looking at the kids that you are ministering to today and comparing it to your own experience, which was not that long ago. My assumption is they actually feel pretty different because the world that you grew up in, the world that I grew up in, is so dramatically different than the world that these kids are growing up in today.
Yeah.
How do you begin to make sense of that difference, since you are someone who has had this steady connection to the church throughout your life?
Yeah, sometimes I forget how different it is to grow up as a high schooler nowadays, especially because I went to the same high school as some of these kids.
Yeah.
I know what it's like to walk the halls of Waubonsie.
Sure.
But I think one of the biggest differences is that, like, when I was in high school, people were just starting to get on Facebook. Like, it was the switch from like MySpace to Facebook.
Sure.
We were just getting smartphones. Like, there's a huge difference in the ways that social media has changed the dynamic for how kids relate to each other. There's all kinds of studies and things out there around the brain chemistry and the impacts of social media. But just thinking about like the way kids relate to each other, and like how much they're seeing the world. Like, I think there's the few things that I notice as differences are like this increased awareness of what's happening in the world. So like, if we're not talking about the things that are happening in the news or that they're seeing in their social media feed and how that relates to their like, that's part of the real life that they're processing. Is not just like what's happening down the street or what's happening in my soccer game, but like what's happening in DC, what's happening around the world. Like, that's part of their reality because they're so engaged with what's happening on social media. So there's like an increased world awareness. There's a difference in the ways they interact with each other. So thinking about like, just always putting things on Snapchat, keeping your streak going, and like putting things out there on social media, like making a post and then sharing it in your feed so that you get more likes and comments on it, and telling people to like and comment on it. Like, there's a very outward facing reality of how they interact with each other that can be more like, here's the highlights, here's the really good things, without talking about the bad things, or talking about the bad things in order to get the likes and comments. There's sort of this like shift in how they think about the highs and lows that they're experiencing and who's going to see those. And then just like the highs and lows of relationships. Like, can you be with someone? Can you have a boyfriend or girlfriend that is just like doing normal stuff instead of like a giant promposal that like makes a really good reel or a TikTok video? Like, or
just doing normal stuff.
Like,
we're all out here just trying to do normal stuff.
I think sometimes I think about the sort of everyday long-term nature of relationships, that you just do normal stuff, and like, it's not for the highlight reel, and it's not really exciting sometimes. It's just life. But you still need those people. That doesn't make them any less valuable to you.
Right.
And so you're like engaging with people because like relationships matter, and not because you're trying to like get something out of it. So I see some of those shifts on top of the normal things that happen, especially when we think about like students in our area of like Naperville schools and the overperforming and the high pressure environments. And so some of those things I can relate to because I know what it's like to take full AP classes. Like, I get some of that mentality of some of our students that are here. But some of that, like engaging with social media, being very outward facing, sort of the wrestling with authenticity, but also like appropriate sharing, some of those things, I'm like, okay, all right, let's backtrack here. I have to like remind myself that there are some differences.
Well, I always think that's helpful for people to hear articulated like you just did, because there's this sense that I think too many of us walk around looking at this generation of folks going like, man, you're from a different planet. And it's like, yeah, we are.
Yeah.
We're from a smartphone planet. We're from a COVID planet. We're from like the level of disruption that these folks have had to endure is remarkable. And to hear that from someone like you, who is only a decade or so ahead of them, 15 years ahead of them, is illustrative to those who are much further, who are looking at that gap and going, not being able to understand it. The fact that you still feel that gap, I think really matters to people, because one of the things that you said there that I want to dig into is you talked about how this generation knows so much. And I think for a while, I think the conversation shifted a little bit. We were treating what folks were experiencing digitally and what folks were experiencing in person as distinct.
Yeah.
And for today's kids, to sound like I'm 100 years old, for today's kids, they're the same.
Yeah, they're the same.
And I saw this recently that said, back in the day, content was scarce, but community was abundant. And now community is scarce and content is abundant. And what I hope people hear in that is the opportunity that the church has, because you are someone who has benefited from a community that even through all of this shifts that you yourself also experienced, you have been able to stay connected to a community of faith. You have been able to stay connected to having a relationship with Jesus. When there's the other thing you said though was about authenticity. The mistake that I think a lot of people make is assuming that we have to match a level of performance, that we have to, there's this TikTok video that has 75 million views. So I have to go create something that has the same level of production quality, or I have to go create the same level of expertise. When in reality, what this generation is craving is authenticity. I heard someone articulate this, Sam Luce out as a pastor out in New York, and he talked about how the difference between Walt Disney and Mr. Rogers. And the idea was there's too many churches out there who are trying to chase these like Disney type of experiences, when in reality, the role of the church is to be Mr. Rogers. Disney is a fantasy land. Mr. Rogers lives in the neighborhood with you.
Yeah.
As a students minister, you have this unique position because you are, in some cases, elevated as someone who's supposed to know. How do you handle the pressures of that, but also the sort of, for lack of a better term, popularity problem that can come with students looking to you for their faith when you are at the same time trying to help them develop their own faith themselves?
Yeah, I think the reality of youth ministry is that you're trying to form relationships with youth. Like, if you don't have the relational credibility, why are you there? If you don't genuinely enjoy hanging out with young people, then like you're missing the mark. Because
there's lots of other less hard jobs in the church, like working in communications.
Sure. You don't have to hang out with middle and high schoolers. But like that, if I didn't genuinely enjoy hanging out with them, like, then I would not be good at my job. And so like the elevation, it can happen because you're on a stage, you're in front of them, you're in charge of things. You come up with a cool game and then you play it with them. Like, so there's kind of the sort of like, I'm the cool adult factor of being in youth ministry. And you want them to think you're a cool adult. But you also, there's a couple things that come to mind. One is like, I can't be the only cool adult. Like, it can't be all about me. One, because there could be anywhere from, when I think of high school ministry, there could be anywhere from 30 to 80 kids that I want to get to know. And it can't be all on me. Like, I need to develop a team of cool adults of all ages, like that are willing to hang around with high schoolers and hear about their drama and know that the tests are coming up this week and like hear about the prom colors and all of that. Like, I can't do it alone. So like part of kind of diminishing the sort of, celebrity, like everyone wants to be like me sort of nature is being like, have you guys talked to Denise?
Right.
Because Denise has the coolest job. Or like, do you know that Heidi can do this? Like pointing out the other adults that like are a part of the youth ministry and the cool things that they do, is one of like the best ways to kind of tone that down, because it's not just about me, and I'm not going to be the one that's like in their small group every single week. There's somebody else that's doing that. So I want to like hype up the other adults that are around me.
That's a great tactic. Yeah. It's also because Heidi and Denise are probably somebody else's parent.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh yeah.
And the ability to, we talk about this all the time at Awana. My friend Melanie, who hosts the Child Discipleship podcast every week, which y'all should listen to, she talked about this once, about how the relationship between parents and the church sometimes feels like it's like this bridge that can't be crossed. And we have this cultural problem. Parents, research-wise, study-wise, collectively have outsourced so much of discipleship of their kids to the church. Every week we send our kids to experts in soccer practice. So we have effectively done the same with the church.
Yeah.
However, all of that is true, and yet it is still incumbent on the church to cross that bridge first. And what I hear you doing by that very simple tactic of hyping up other adults is the ability to help them understand that like there are other adults here who are for them, and they also happen to be somebody else's parent, somebody else's mom, somebody else's dad, and they're able to connect to the idea that there is actually this community of people around them, and it doesn't all have to stop and begin and end with you.
Yeah. And I think like pointing out those adults is so important. Having those adults is so important. Like that's what one of the things that research shows is that when you have other adults outside your parents that are investing in you as a teenager, you are more likely to develop a faith that lasts. Like that's foundational.
Yeah.
So being able to like invite people into serving into ministry that like are going to be those people that care about these kids, no matter how old they are, like, and then telling the kids like, hey, you need to know this person. Like they really like you. They're really cool.
Yeah.
Or inviting them to come up and teach that week or share their story in front of them, or kind of offer those reflections of what it was like for them to be in high school.
Right.
Kind of helps to develop those relationships, because I'm not always the one in the spotlight.
Yeah. I want to put a button on that, because there's a thing that I think too often happens related to serving with students, serving with kids particularly, which is this idea of, oh, that's not for me. And the only silver lining in how challenging child discipleship can be, or how challenging youth discipleship can be, is that it's literally for everyone. It doesn't matter how introverted you are. We need someone to make sure that the building is secure. It doesn't matter how challenging your high school experience was. We need someone who's able to come alongside that kid who is having just as challenging, or if not more so, of a challenging high school experience.
Because there's always somebody that is like you when you were in high school.
Yeah.
Like, and if you're an introvert, you see the kids that are introverted. You see the one that is brand new that shows up to youth ministry that like maybe someone else didn't like. Those. That's really important to have different leaders that are present, because then you're able to like develop a team of people that has the strengths and weaknesses that like match the experience of high schoolers and middle schoolers. Yeah.
So one of the things that I want to make sure we touch on before we wrap up, you are someone who's looking ahead to a future as a pastor, and thinking about this conversation, what a lot of pastors are dealing with is you're not able to be as close to this conversation as you've been as a student. You're not able to be as close to, even in some cases, as individual relationships. You just talked about helping build a team. Thinking about the conversation around entrusted faith, thinking about how that worked, this sort of generational argument. How do you think about what you'll be doing as a leader? You're already doing this, but looking ahead a little bit to help others feel the same sense of ownership in passing on the faith that God has so clearly developed in you.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that I feel like I observe no matter what level of leadership I'm at is that if I'm not coaching and teaching and building into relationship with others, then I'm not modeling that for any of my teams. So I remember this when I first started middle school ministry. Like I was like, I'm not sure if I like middle schoolers, or like, I've been discipling like college students. How do I shift to like middle schoolers? What does that look like? And as I was recruiting volunteers, that's when it kind of hit me like, oh, I need to invest in these volunteers so that they understand what that looks like. Mm-hmm. And then they can do that with the students that they're in small groups with. And so then we fashioned our leader meetings in such a way that like they could copy that. We did it for adults in terms of prayer and highs and lows and kind of the things that we talked about, but then made that really easy for them to then use those same terms, talk about how they should be interacting with students.
Right.
And so when I think about like being a pastor, I think about that those same things apply. Mm-hmm. Like I may not, when you're in those sort of upper levels of leadership, you may not get the same sort of day-to-day interaction of the ministry happenings within a church, but you're still around people that are leading those people.
Yeah.
And so how you lead the people that you are close with then matters because then you're modeling for them how the ways that like they should be coaching and leading their teams. And so it continues to kind of model and spread from there. Mm-hmm. But I think it's also important, like for me, I can't get too far away from the actual discipleship piece. Like there always still needs to be a part of me that's doing that discipleship. Like whether that's in sort of less formal relationships or mm-hmm. more formal environments, whether that's serving in an area of the church that's like under my responsibility, but, different from what I kind of do in my job responsibilities, I think, because then if you get too far away from it, then you've lost sort of the reality of being able to coach others through it. Mm-hmm. And so I think about, that of like continuing to be practicing, some of the ideas of entrusted faith there. But I think about also how I'm going to become a mom, and then I'm going to be doing some entrusted faith practices just like in my own house. Yeah. And that's going to be a new field for me of like, how do I disciple my kids? What does that look like in our family of David and I growing up in two different families and different ways of entrusting the faith to the next generation. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities for that still mm-hmm. that I don't think about now as someone who doesn't have kids. Like I've just been doing ministry by myself. Sure. With nobody at home to take care of. Yeah. And so I think that's going to provide a different perspective for me, no matter what official roles God might have me in. Like there's still going to be a lot of learning for sure, and dealing with reality at home.
But one of the things that I think is very helpful for folks to hear you articulate is the idea that, having kids of your own, it changes every atom in your body. Sure. But the core of what you're describing doesn't change. The core responsibilities of what you're describing don't change. We have all been, forgive the bad pun, entrusted to do this work.
Yeah, I think I think that's what's so key to me about this is that like the idea of entrusted faith is not just for people who are in ministry or just for people who want to be pastors,
or just for parents.
Like it's not for those people alone. Is for all of us as Christians because we have inherited a faith, and the faith we have inherited is meant to be passed down. That's why that word, I think, entrusted is so important, is because it's about that responsibility and action that comes with it. That's why I kind of said the Spider-Man reference with great power comes great responsibility. We've inherited such a great gift in Jesus. That's life-changing. That changes everything.
Yeah.
And it's not meant for just us, and we can get really insular and thinking about, oh, how do I grow my faith? How do I learn to trust the Holy Spirit? How do we pray? Like we can get in that sort of mentality, but ultimately the faith was given to us to give to somebody else. And as Christians, that's a universal responsibility. And so I think about it in ways in terms of being a pastor and being a youth leader, because that's my context and that's my calling. Like that's the vocation that God has given me. But as Christians, we should be doing that in all of the areas of our life, no matter where we're at and what we're doing. And I think that's the beauty of having an entrusted faith, inheriting an entrusted faith.
Thank you for listening to the Encounter Faith podcast. This podcast is a service of G. Shep Productions from Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Naperville, Illinois. All rights reserved. If you're in the area, we'd love to meet you on a Sunday morning at our 9 a.m. or 10:45 services. At Good Shepherd, we are inviting everyone to walk together in the calling of Christ for a life of eternal impact. This podcast is produced and hosted by me, Ross Cochran, and our theme song is Wake the Earth by 1111 Worship. Thank you for listening. We'll talk again soon.